his aunt, Zaidee Creel Williams. Ms. Williams graduated from Lynchburg College in 1924 and went on to teach in public schools in Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia. We thank Dr. Creel for his generous gift and regret to say that he is unable to join us today. Events of this kind are the work of many hands. Speaking on behalf of my colleagues in the Department of Religious Studies, I would like to thank Shannon Brennan, Ann Nash, and Chris Peterson in the Office of College Communications and Marketing. Chris designed the programs as well as the flyers posted around campus. Greg Sigler and Samantha Bryant posted many of those flyers. Nate Campbell and John Harvey distributed the programs. Tess Evans will be at the book table out in the lobby after the lecture. There you can purchase copies of Dr. Prothero's New York Times best-selling Religious Literacy and have your copy signed by the author. Ashley Durr is our video recorder. To all of you, thank you for your work. For their unflagging support of the Zaidee Creel Williams lecture series, as well as the ongoing work of the Religious Studies Department, I would also like to thank Dean Kim McCabe, Dean Julius Sigler, and Lynchburg College President Kenneth Guerin. It's a pity that Dr. Austin Creel could not be with us this afternoon because he and our speaker would have much to discuss. For many years, Dr. Creel served as professor of religion at the University of Florida. Along with his scholarly work in religious ethics and Hinduism, Dr. Creel possessed a keen interest in the teaching of religion. In the late 1980s, he developed a 4-week summer school for middle and high school teachers who were interested in teaching religion but lacked the knowledge necessary to do so. Many teachers also were uncomfortable addressing religious topics. Dr. Creel did not think either one of those reasons warranted the exclusion of religion as a topic of study in secondary education. He felt knowledge of religion was important in order for American students to become responsible global citizens. The importance of religious knowledge, or religious literacy, to use our speaker's phrase, brings us to Dr. Stephen Prothero. I met Steve when I was a graduate student at Boston University. He and his colleague Peter Berger had just received a grant from the Smith-Richardson Foundation. They were going to organize 2 roundtable discussions on the growing influence of religions in American public life that were not Christianity or Judaism. They were going to look at Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs. The project was called Nation of Religions, the Politics of Pluralism in Multi-Religious America. They needed someone to oversee the organization of these discussions, which is where I entered the picture. Steve invited me to stop by his office to discuss the Nation of Religions project. Toward the end of our conversation, I remember him saying words to this effect: "I think we have a topic many people are very interested in and will be talking about it." Indeed, this was a topic everyone would be talking about, sooner than Steve or anyone else would have thought. Talk began, in fact, the very next day, September 11, 2001. Stephen Prothero is professor of religion at Boston University. He is the author of the bestseller Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. Other works include God is Not One, the 8 rival religions that run the world and why their differences matter. He is also the author of many other highly regarded books and essays. Dr. Prothero, it is safe to say, boldly goes where few academics have gone before. He has appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Colbert Report. He has even appeared on the Temple Mount of American popular culture, The Oprah Winfrey Show. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and privilege to present 2011 Zaidee Creel Williams Lecturer, Dr. Stephen Prothero.
Thank you, Steve. I think the last time I saw Steve before today was his dissertation defense, and he did a great job. It was actually one of the best dissertation defenses I have attended in about 15 years at Boston University. So it's nice to be here. And I am remembering now, based on what Steve said, that when we started that project on Nation of Religions, we started before 9/11, and then I think our first meeting was maybe just a few days after 9/11. I remember that. It was really interesting to be thinking about this question of how do you make sense of non-Judeo-Christian religions in America in light of what was then sort of immediately jump-started national conversation about Islam. So anyway, it's very nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to all your professors who are giving you extra credit for being here. Really appreciate that. On a beautiful Sunday. It's a nicer Sunday here than it is in Boston, so I'm doubly indebted to you for being here. Let me start with this with a relatively obvious point, I hope, particularly after 9/11, which is that religion matters. Obviously, religion matters in the private lives of billions of practitioners who love Jesus, who observe the Jewish commandments, who surrender to Allah, who devote themselves to Krishna. But what I'm talking about in terms of the import of religion is the public power of religion. Religion matters because it is a powerful force in politics, in economics, and even in militaries around the world. New atheists such as Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Professor Dawkins, and Dennett say that religion is the greatest force for evil in world history. And perhaps as a religious studies scholar, I shouldn't say this, but I agree with them. I think that's true. But I think that religion is also one of the greatest forces for good in world history, which is to say that religion is the sort of force that we cannot ignore. It moves elections in India and the United States. It moves economies in Saudi Arabia and Iran. It moves militaries the world over. It motivates the fears of those who are witnessing the so-called Revolution 2.0 in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere, and many of the realities on the ground in those countries. Even if religion does not make sense to you, you need to make sense of religion in order to make sense of the world. You can't understand any of the world's major hotspots without knowing something about the religious commitments that heat them up, about Buddhism in Tibet, about Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in Israel, North Africa, and the Middle East, about Hinduism and Islam in Kashmir. If you're interested in economics, you can't understand what's happening in the so-called BRIC economies of Brazil, Russia, India, and China without knowing something about Catholicism and Pentecostalism in Brazil, about Russian Orthodoxy in Russia, about Hinduism and Islam in India, about Confucianism and Taoism in China. Fortunately, since 9/11, there's much more public conversation and some greater awareness about the global power of religion. But unfortunately, Americans know almost nothing about the world's religions. We know very little about our own religious traditions, and we know even less about the religious traditions of other people. And so I think, as a nation, we are relatively powerless to understand what's going on in the wider world and in the United States today. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk with you about this problem of religious illiteracy. And I want to do it in three registers. I want to discuss the problem. I want to have a brief historical segue into the past. How is it that we, as Americans, came to this point where we know so little even about Christianity and the Bible? And then make some modest proposals. So the problem of the past, and proposals. But before I do that, I want to say a little bit about how I got interested in this topic, how I came to be thinking in my professional life about the problem of religious literacy. And it really started when I moved from Atlanta to Boston. My first teaching job was in Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta. And I moved about 15 years ago now up to Boston to take a job at Boston University. And I noticed as I started speaking to my students there that they just didn't really seem to understand what I was talking about. In retrospect, probably my students in Atlanta didn't understand either, but I didn't get that until I moved to Boston. And what I particularly noticed at Boston University was my students started giving me the look. And we all know what the look is. The look is how you look when someone tells you something and you know you should understand what they're saying, but you don't understand what they're saying, and you don't want them to know that you don't know what they're saying, right? So that's the look, and they were giving it to me. It goes something like this. It goes like, so I would say, you know, Matthew, and they would be thinking Matthew Perry of Friends, and I would say Luke, and they would be thinking Luke Perry of 90210. And so I realized that I needed to figure out what they knew before I could really start teaching them on the theory that, you know, education begins where your students are rather than the place you wish your students would be. And so I developed this quiz that I published in the back of my religious literacy book, where I tried to gauge in what I thought were sort of the simplest possible terms, basic understanding about Christianity, Judaism, the Bible, and the world's religions in terms of three things: doctrine, practice, and story or narrative. So I asked what I thought were pretty simple questions. What's the first book of the Hebrew Bible? What are the four Gospels? And I found my students did a very poor job, not only with those questions, but even worse with questions like, what's the holy book in Islam? Name a Hindu scripture. What are the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism? And I had a section at the end where I was trying to gauge, as best as you can in a quiz of this sort, the narrative literacy that my students had about the Bible. So I created a couple columns. I had a left column where I had Bible characters like Adam and Eve, and then I had a right column where I had a Bible story like the Garden of Eden. And their job was to draw a line from the one to the other. If they could draw from Adam and Eve to Garden of Eden, they would get 5 points, you know. To be fair to my students, they were able to do that for the most part. 9 out of 10 of my students knew Adam and Eve and went together with the Garden of Eden. But then I had slightly more difficult things. I had Noah and the Great Flood. I had Abraham and the binding of Isaac. I had Moses and the parting of the Red Sea. And I had them set up in columns, and their job was to, you know, draw the correct lines. But pretty soon I found out that apparently it was the Apostle Paul who had led the Israelites across the Red Sea. You know, and Moses had been there in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. And I got a lot of quiz responses where I had students who just started in the left column with Jesus, and they just drew a line to everything in the right column. You know, I think they figured that you know, they'd actually heard of this guy, and maybe he was involved with these stories in one way or another. So this was really humbling to me to see that 89% of my students failed this test. Only 11% got 60 or higher on this quiz. And it wasn't, in my view, a kind of gotcha quiz. It really was, here's the simplest possible quiz I could construct for college students entering a course on the world's religions. What do they know about this topic? And what I found was they knew very little. So then I thought, okay, where else could I look? And I decided I would look inside my own family and my children. And I didn't realize it was a policy at the time, but it was a policy of really not talking about my work with my kids. My father had been a medical doctor. He worked a lot of hours in training, and when he started being a doctor, and when he would come home, he wouldn't talk about medicine. It was just his policy. You know, he'd talk to his kids about other things. And so I just had that in my head that that's what you were supposed to do as a parent. And so I just really wasn't. I really wasn't talking to my kids about not only about the world's religions, but really about the Bible or Christianity or anything. And so my daughter was, at the time, both my daughters were going to this Lutheran church on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. in New England, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And it was Bible Sunday. And Bible Sunday in the Lutheran Church is the day when you gather the second graders who have been baptized up around the altar and you give them the Bible. It's to fulfill a baptismal vow that's made by parents and godparents as the kids are being baptized as infants, where you say you promise to put the scripture in the hands of the baptismal candidate. So this is the moment when you actually do that. So I was standing there up with my daughter, and she was very proud. And the pastor gave me this Bible to give to my daughter. And it was a children's Bible. It had a picture of Jesus. Well, and it wasn't Jesus on the cover. It was a guy. He looked like me. This sort of American white guy with long hair and the proper little cleft thing in his chin that Jesus somehow we know had from all his iconography. And he had a lamb on his shoulders, and there were adoring children looking up at him. You know, exactly the kind of thing you might expect you'd be giving to a second-grade American kid. So I handed it to her. And we walked out after the service to the car, and I thought, we were driving away, and I thought, all right, this is a teachable moment. Let's see what my daughter knows about the Bible. And so I said, let's talk about the Bible. And she said, great. And I said, I want you to tell me about some Bible characters. And she said, great. And I said, but not Jesus. That's too easy. And I looked in the rear view, and she was giving me the look. And then she coughed. And then she coughed again. And then she said, Tom. I was thinking, Tom? You know? And then I thought, okay, doubting Thomas, right? You know, maybe he was Tom to his friends. But that was it. That's all I got. Jesus and Tom. So the next week in church, the reading was from the Old Testament reading was the story of Moses. He's in the desert with the Israelites, and they're thirsty, and he's mad, and he hits a rock, and the water comes out of the rock. And so my kids get in the car, and my youngest kid, you know, the Jesus and Tom kid, she was totally ready. You know, I said, let's talk about Moses. She knew so much about Moses. And there was Moses and the bulrushes and Egypt and the plagues and let my people go and enslavement of the Israelites and the Red Sea and the parting of the Red Sea and Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. And she just went on and on and on about Moses. Very proud. I think she must have studied up on Moses. She must have read ahead for the liturgical week and seen what was there, or she had paid really good attention in Sunday school to a very good lesson. And I then asked my older daughter in this good liberal Lutheran church in New England, you know, what she had learned in her Sunday school class for the day. And she said she learned about water as a scarce world resource. She learned about evaporation, precipitation, and condensation. That was her lesson for the day. So this helped me, combined with my conversations with my students, help me realize the problem of religious illiteracy, and got me thinking about this problem in America. And right about this time, I was at school, and I was standing around the copier, and I was talking to an Austrian colleague of mine. He had come from Europe to teach a course on Catholicism and Orthodoxy, the history of relations between Roman Catholics and the Orthodox communion of Christianity. And he was one of the world's experts on this. He was an advisor to John Paul II, the Pope. He was a Catholic, but his expertise was in Orthodoxy. He was so excited to come to this country and teach this course. And he just turned to me in frustration. He said, you know, I can't teach this course. He said, my students, they don't know anything about Christianity. He said, half my students are in the seminary here. Almost all of them go to church. but none of them knows anything about the first thing about Christianity. He said, in Austria, none of my students would ever even ponder the possibility of going to church. But they all know about the history of Christianity, and they know about the Bible, because they have mandatory religious studies education from essentially K through 12. So he helped to frame for me the main thesis of this religious literacy book, which is that the United States is one of the most religious countries on earth, and yet Americans know almost nothing about religion. We know very little about our own religions, and we know even less about the religions of other people. Now, when I started working on this problem, I wanted to go and find some data. Unfortunately, at the time at least, we didn't have any full-scale national survey about religious knowledge in the United States. We now have one. We had one, first one ever in American history, was done in fall of 2010. But when I was working on this, the data was really sort of scattershot. You had to go find surveys that were mostly about what Americans believed religiously or what they did religiously, and sometimes there would be a question thrown in. I remember about knowledge. And I remember once in the 60s there was a survey, and the question was, do you know the 10 Commandments? And the answers the Americans were offered were yes and no. So you could just say, oh yeah, I know the 10 Commandments, and then you get checked off, yeah, knows the 10 Commandments. Nobody ever said, well, could you just give me a few of them? You know, let's see if you actually know about them. But I was able to find a little bit of survey data. For example, and these are mostly from Gallup polls, most Americans do not know that Genesis is the first book of the Bible. Most Americans cannot name any of the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 10% of Americans think that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. That's good. Only a third know that Jesus is credited with giving the Sermon on the Mount. Many of them think Billy Graham gave that sermon. And a sizable minority think that Sodom and Gomorrah were a happily married biblical couple. Now we do have this new survey. The U.S. Religious Knowledge Survey came out in September, October of last year. And the people at the Pew Forum who did the survey, they asked 32 questions of Americans about Christianity, the Bible, the world's religions, a little bit about religious history, a few questions about church and state issues, particularly religion and public education. And the average score on the test was 16 out of 32, which was 50%. And I was a consultant to the Pew Forum while they were writing this up, and I said, we have to say, Americans flunked. That's the lead. Americans flunked the survey. And they said, no, we can't do that. We just offer the data. People can decide what they think about it. So they gave the data, and I wrote a piece for CNN's Belief blog where I write that said Americans flunked the survey, which they did. They got 16 out of 32 questions. Some of the interesting questions on the survey I thought were pretty revealing. One was about the Holy Book of Islam. What's the Holy Book of Islam? Mind you, this is done in 2010. This is not done in 1999. This is done after almost a decade of conversation about Islam and the Quran in American politics and American culture. Only 54% of Americans, barely above half, were able to name the Quran as the Holy Book of Islam. There were a series of questions about what is the majority religion in a given country. We asked about Indonesia. Indonesia is the country in the world with the most Muslims. We often think about Islam as a Middle Eastern religion, but only about 20% of Muslims in the world speak Arabic and can read the Quran in Arabic. The largest area for Muslims in the world is actually Asia. And so we asked about that. Only about 27% of Americans knew that Indonesia was a Muslim majority country. We did not ask if the Pope was Catholic, but we did ask what's the religion of the Dalai Lama, and most Americans did not know the Dalai Lama was Buddhist. A lot of people thought he was Jewish, sounded like a Jewish name, but only 47% knew that the Dalai Lama was a Buddhist. I thought one of the most intriguing findings, some of the most intriguing findings on the survey had to do with religion and public education. And this is germane to the question of how are we to solve this problem, or at least attack this problem of religious illiteracy in America. And one question was, can teachers lead public high school students in prayer? And the answer is no. It's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has said this clearly. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And 90% of Americans knew that. In fact, this was the question Americans did best on. More than any other question, they knew the right answer to this. They know you're not allowed, teachers are not allowed to lead students in prayer. Then there was a question, can teachers teach comparative religion? Teach about the world's religions in the public school? Is that constitutional? Only a third of Americans know that that's constitutional. 2/3 of Americans think that it violates the First Amendment to teach about Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism in the public schools. Only a quarter of Americans know that it's constitutional to teach about the Bible in the public schools. This was a third question. Can a teacher read from the Bible as an example of literature and teach about the Bible in a public school? 3/4 of Americans are unaware that that's constitutional. How do we solve this problem in the public schools if most Americans think you can't even talk about God or the Bible or the world's religions without violating the First Amendment? Tricky issue. Now, religious illiteracy is obviously a religious problem. It's a problem if you're Jewish and you want to raise a generation of Jews if young people and old people who might be teaching them don't know anything about Judaism. It's a problem if you're an evangelical and you want to raise the next generation of Bible-believing Christians if your generation and your children don't know anything about the Bible. It's a problem if you're Catholic, to raise your kids Catholic if you don't know anything about Catholicism and can't teach them. It's also a liberal arts problem. How do you make sense of many of the great American novels? Almost any picture hanging in a Western museum before Andy Warhol, many of which have biblical themes. How do you make sense of these pieces of art and Western civilization without knowing something about the biblical narratives on which they're based? But the focus of this project for me, this book project, isn't on religious illiteracy as a religious problem or as a liberal arts problem, but as a political and a civic problem. So what do I mean by that? Let me explain that a little bit. And I see this in two directions, as a domestic problem, a domestic challenge, and an international challenge. The domestic challenge, I think, is this. We now have two religious political parties. We used to have 0 at certain points in American history, but starting in the late 1970s, the Republican Party decided that it was going to respond to the cultural revolution of the 1960s by being an anti-60s party and by speaking out against sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the name of God, the Bible, Jesus, family values, and morality. They were going to use this language. This turned out to be a very successful strategy, in part because the Democrats responded to them by repeating language that goes back to Thomas Jefferson and others, that this is inappropriate, that the First Amendment articulates a wall of separation between church and state. Religion is a private matter, should not intrude into the public square. It was inappropriate for politicians to even talk about religion. And so they just left talk about religion over to the Republicans. Now, Democrats may be stupider than Republicans, but they're only usually stupider for like a generation. Because they let this go on for a generation, and finally they realized that it probably wasn't the best strategy politically in a country where 95 or 98% of the citizens believe in God to be the party that was indifferent to or uninterested in God. And so after the presidential defeat in 2004, the Democrats decided that they too were going to talk about God, and this they did. They had debates where the Democratic candidates for president got together, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and John Edwards and others, and they spoke about their faith. They spoke about religion in public life. They connected their public policy perspectives with the teachings of the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. Hillary Clinton spoke out against Republican initiatives on immigration, including a proposal that we should have laws that would mandate that Americans turn in illegal immigrants to the authorities if they knew those people were here illegally. And she rejected it on the grounds of Scripture. She said that it was contrary to the teachings of the Good Samaritan story. So we now have two religious political parties. And people in these parties appeal regularly now to the Bible, to God, to Jesus even, in support of their views. They do this on abortion. They do this on euthanasia. They do this on stem cell research. They do this on gay marriage, the sort of arenas we've been conditioned into thinking our politicians will talk about in religious terms ever since the 1980s and 1990s. But they also do it on tax policy. They do it on poverty. They do it on war. They do it on torture, in part because Democrats are now involved in this conversation about religion and politics. Just in the last few weeks, we've had a conversation about what would Jesus cut? What would Jesus cut? Jesus is obviously a deficit hawk. He's concerned about the deficit. What would he cut? We're not really asking what taxes he would raise, because apparently that's off the table in heaven as well. But we are asking what he would cut. So we have this weird situation where politicians can get a competitive advantage by appealing to God, but we don't have citizens or journalists who are sufficiently well-versed in religion to call them to account, to say, okay, connect the dots for us on your views on this question or that with the Bible. Don't just say, I'm opposed to abortion because I'm a Christian, or I'm opposed to this immigration rule because of the Good Samaritan story. We ought to, in a more fully functioning democracy, be able to say, well, tell us the Good Samaritan story and tell us how it actually connects to this immigration policy. Or tell us where in the Bible it says something about abortion that makes you think abortion is right or abortion is wrong. But we don't do that. So we just keep giving kind of free pass to politicians to keep bringing more and more and more of religion into the public space. And they get a kind of a halo over themselves for doing it, but we don't get to challenge them. And I think this is a problem for a fully functioning democracy, which, as Thomas Jefferson and others founders argued from the very beginning of the American experiment in Republican government, democracy requires an informed citizenry that can fully engage with their politicians on these public policy questions. Now, when you shift from the domestic problem of religious illiteracy to the international problem, I think the situation becomes graver. Because now it becomes not an issue of a fully functioning democracy, but an issue of life and death. And what we have in this case, I think, is we have our military and our State Department and our president and others engaged in countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, where we don't understand the culture, where we don't speak the language, where we don't know very much about the religion. This puts us at a grave disadvantage. Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, she wrote a book a few years ago called The Mighty and the Almighty. And in that book she says that when she was Secretary of State, she had hundreds of political and economic advisors she could call on any time of the day or night if she had a question about economics or politics in any country in the world. The GDP in Dubai, political parties in India, whatever it might be. But when it came to religion, she had 0 advisors. When it came to, if she had a question about Islam or about Hinduism, she would, I don't know what she would do. She would go to Wikipedia. She would go to Google. She would Google it. She would ask her daughter or her son to Google it. This is not a problem if the world is run purely on greed and power, if the world is run purely in terms that can be understood by economists and politicians, right? If people are purely economic and political animals, unmotivated by religious faith, religious practice, then this is a sound way to run the State Department. It's a sound way to run the American military and the American Defense Department. But where I started speaking tonight in terms of the import, public power of religion, I think you'll understand that I think this is a false anthropology. It's a false understanding of the human being. Human beings and human societies have always been furiously religious. And the world we live in today is also furiously religious. And you can't understand what's going on in it as Americans and act in it economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily, without knowing something about the religions that inform the places where we're trying to act, without knowing something about Buddhism in Sri Lanka, or knowing something, as I said earlier, about Hinduism and Islam in Kashmir. So this is the challenge of religious illiteracy, that it makes it difficult for us to understand our domestic politics. It makes it very difficult for us to act effectively in the world. Now, how did this happen? How do we get to this situation in America? Because in the colonial period and into the early national period, Americans actually knew a lot about the Bible and about Christianity and a teeny bit about Judaism. We have never known anything about Islam. We've never known anything about Hinduism and Buddhism. But we used to know a lot, at least, about Christianity in the Bible. And this is my very brief, I promise it will be brief, historical section. If you are allergic to history, my students are not particularly interested in history. They tell me that was about the past. And so they're not really that interested in it. But so if you're not interested in this topic, you might just take a little moment, just kind of zone out for a little bit and ask your neighbor to nudge you in 5 minutes when I'm done with this little historical segue. So just fair warning. But let me do this very briefly. How do we get here? Now, the story that we hear from the religious right is that this happened in the 1960s. Particularly it happened in 1962 and 1963 when the U.S. Supreme Court issued two very important rulings about religion and public education where they said that you can't pray, teachers can't lead students in prayer, and you can't read the Bible as a devotional text. Two cases in 62 and 63. This is when religion was taken out of the public schools. This is when religion was pushed out of the public square. And in other words, it was secular religious people in the secular people in the U.S. Supreme Court who created this horrible situation where we broke the chain of memory that was religious knowledge in American culture and gave us the situation we're in today. Now, I think this is wrong. I think it's historically inaccurate. I think it's off by about 100 years, and I think the villains are different. So here's my version of the story. My version of the story is that in the colonial period and into the early national period, literacy and religious literacy were conjoined. How did you learn to read in colonial New England or colonial Virginia? Most houses had 0 to 1 books. And if they had a book, the book they had was the Bible. What you would do is your parent would read to you the 23rd Psalm or the Sermon on the Mount or the 10 Commandments. And you would memorize it before you could read. And at a certain point, they would teach you the alphabet, the sounds of some of the letters and some of the letter combinations. And they would open the Bible to the 23rd Psalm. And they would help you read it. You already knew it. When my daughter was little, she did this with The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. She could turn the page. She couldn't read, but she would turn the pages perfectly correctly and read with this great intonation. The cat in the hat comes back. She wasn't reading. She was memorizing, and she was repeating and turning the pages at the appropriate moments when her parents had turned the pages. But what you do in this is the similar thing, but now you are learning to read. And you're saying the 23rd Psalm in a more halting way because you're trying to connect it with the words on the page. So literally, literacy was accompanied by biblical literacy. And this was reinforced in the earliest American school books. In the New England Primer that was popular up and down the eastern seaboard in the colonial period, in Webster's Speller, which was the most popular and widely used book for teaching reading up really through the generation of Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, it was the best-selling book in American history until the Harry Potter series, Webster's Speller. And in these books, and in later books like the McGuffey Readers that were popular in the Midwest, the Bible was the assumed common coin, that you could refer to biblical characters, Jesus and Satan, biblical stories of Adam and Eve, and because those were common cultural coin. And so those textbooks also taught about the world and about reading and about writing through the language of the Bible. And so when we got as a country to debate slavery in the run-up to the Civil War, the debate that we had as a nation was very sophisticated, and it was biblical. It was biblically based, because both sides understood if you could prove that God, speaking through the Bible, was in favor of slavery, that slavery would stand in the United States. And if you could prove that God, speaking through the Bible, was opposed to slavery, then slavery would fall in the United States. Both sides knew that. And so both sides appealed to the Bible. And the argument they had was, as I said, very sophisticated, totally different from the conversation we're having now about Islam, where we have, some idiot gets on TV from the secular left and says, Islam is a religion of peace, and some idiot from the religious right gets on and says Islam is a religion of war, and then they go back and forth, and one side says, no, actually it's a religion of peace, actually it's a religion of war. No, really, it's a religion of peace, actually it's a religion of war. And that's all they say, because that's all they can say, because we don't know anything about the Quran. We can't have a public conversation about the Quran. But we had a public conversation about slavery that was rooted in the biblical text, and in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament texts, in Paul's letters, in the parables and stories of Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, etc. This is already going over 5 minutes, so I apologize. I'll try to get through the history part quick. When does this shift? It shifts in the 1830s and 1840s. It shifts when two main things happen. One is the emergence of evangelical Christianity, the Second Great Awakening, this new form of Christianity that is maybe in the 80s and 90s was maybe most visible in this town, evangelicalism. And that form of religion displaced the old form of American religion, which was Puritanism. And in Puritanism, there was always a conversation between the head and the heart. It was understood that God spoke to us through our affect and emotions, but God also spoke to us through our intellect. We were to read the Bible, but we were also to look out into nature and use methods of science to see what God was teaching us through the natural world which God had created. But when evangelicalism emerges, you get this different kind of religion that is really about emotion and feeling. It's about loving Jesus rather than listening to what Jesus had to say in the Bible. It's about a personal relationship with Christ. And you can see this actually in some of the iconography of Jesus in the 19th century. If you look in the colonial period or in the early 19th century, images of Jesus are always biblical. You can always say what biblical story is being evoked. Oh, that's Jesus walking on water. Oh, that's Jesus giving a Sermon on the Mount. Oh, that's Jesus at the Last Supper. That's Jesus being crucified. That's Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. But when you get into the late part of the 19th century, images of Jesus, they start being just Jesus. They start being like yearbook photo Jesus. he's this. And he's looking at you, and he's inviting you to be his prom date. He's inviting you into having a personal relationship with him. It's totally divorced from the biblical text. This is done by a community that claims to be all about the biblical text. But they're extracting Jesus from the Bible stories and offering to you as this person with whom you can have this individual relationship. But the teaching about the Bible starts to fall away. You see this still today in American evangelical and fundamentalist churches. There's a real split between the truly biblically based churches where each week the preacher gets up and preaches based on a biblical text, and the churches where the preacher gets up and talks to you about how he was walking through the mall the other day and something happened to him, without connecting it back to the biblical text. That's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens has to do with the Bible in the public schools. And the Bible actually goes out of the public schools not in the 1960s, but it starts to go out in the 1850s and 1860s. And what happens is that when you start to get cities in the United States with sufficiently large Catholic populations, Catholic priests and Catholic parents start to ask why their students are reading the King James Bible in the public schools. Because all the public schools that started in the United States in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they're all reading the King James Bible. Because the point of the public schools was to create citizens. And citizens needed to be moral. And morality was only secured by religion. And the only true religion was Christianity. And the only true form of Christianity was Protestantism. And the only true basis of Protestantism was the Bible. And the only true Bible was the King James Bible. So everybody was reading the King James Bible. And Catholics started saying, why is my kid reading the false Bible? How can you understand this Bible with no notes? It has no notes. What's wrong with this Bible? It's just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no one telling you what it means. How can a 12-year-old know what it means? How can a 21-year-old teacher know what it means? In our Bible, it tells you what Augustine and Aquinas and these smart dead people think about these stories. So there were fights between Catholics and Protestants in places like New York and Cincinnati and Boston, areas that had sufficiently large Catholic populations by the 1830s, 1840s, to have fights about this. And in some cases, small Jewish populations chimed in and said, yeah, you're both reading the wrong Bible. We don't like the King James Bible either. So there was basically a gentleman's agreement in a lot of these urban school districts to get rid of the Bible. And the Bible started to go out of public schools in the 1840s and 1850s, not in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay, that's my brief, not so brief, historical moment. You can wake up your neighbors if they ask. They ask to be exempt from the past. Very American of them. So that's the problem in the past. What about the proposal? The proposal is this. I think that we need to teach about religion in our public schools and in our colleges. I'm very glad to hear that there is a religious studies requirement at this college. It's actually unusual. There have been efforts to get requirements in faith and ethics or religious studies in various universities. Harvard University was very close to a requirement in religious studies a few years ago, and it actually got through most of the committees, got to the conversation of the full faculty of the College of Arts and Science, actually the full Harvard faculty. And there were some scientists who said, religion is stupid. We're trying to make kids here smart. Why do they have to study things that are stupid? And the Harvard faculty was sufficiently stupid to say, oh, wow, I never thought about that. And so they got rid of the religious studies requirement. I hope you'll understand that I don't think that studying religion should be predicated on whether there's a God, whether religion is smart, whether religion is stupid, whether Christianity is the one true religion, whether there are many true religions, whether Judaism is the one true religion, whether the new atheists are right or not. It has nothing to do with that. The only question is whether religion is a powerful force in the world and whether anybody can call themselves educated if they don't know anything about it. And my answer to the second question is no. And so I'm glad to hear that there are some places, maybe not Harvard, but at least Lynchburg, where people have to know something about religion in order to graduate from college. I think that's very important. And I've been pushing for a similar requirement at Boston University. We don't have one yet. But I think the place that we really need to look is the public schools. And in my book, I argue that we should have 2 required courses about religion in the public schools. We should have a course about the Bible, and we should have a course about the world's religions. The course about the Bible would address the domestic problem of religious illiteracy, where we have all these politicians talking about the Bible. The Bible is, whether you like it or not, the scripture of American politics. If you look at the congressional record, which records what representatives and senators say on the floor of the House and the Senate, you'll see all sorts of Bible quotations, references to Bible stories, Bible phrases, the Good Samaritan, the Golden Rule, Apocalypse, Armageddon, things like this. It's hard to read that document, the congressional record, without knowing something about the Bible. So, a course on the Bible, I'm not arguing the Bible is true or false, but of course, where students would be exposed to what the Bible says and how it's had an influence on American history and on Western civilization, would help to address that problem. Of course, on the world's religions would address the international problem. The fact that we live in a furiously religious world in which Islam is a growing presence, in which American military calculations, American diplomatic calculations need to be run through some understanding of Islam and Judaism and Christianity in order to be effective. So I think we need to do that. Now, the objections to this are typically twofold. The first objection, which I've already hinted at, is that we can't teach about religion in the public schools because it's unconstitutional. Because we have the First Amendment that says there's no establishment of religion. So how can we teach about religion in the public schools? Well, and this is apparently what between 2/3 and 3/4 of Americans think based on that survey, the Pew survey I spoke about earlier. But if you actually look at Supreme Court rulings, which the Supreme Court has issued since the 1940s, a series of rulings on religion and public education, and they're very consistent in these rulings. They make a distinction. They say there's two ways to talk about religion. There's a religious way to talk about religion, and there's a secular way to talk about religion. There's a distinction, in other words, between preaching religion and teaching about religion. And they say that it's unconstitutional in public schools to preach religion. It's unconstitutional to say Jesus is Lord. It's unconstitutional to say Jesus is the devil. Either of those is not constitutionally kosher. You can't do it. But the Supreme Court repeatedly says in these series of rulings, don't misunderstand us to be saying you can't teach about religion, because you can. You just can't preach about religion. So, for example, in its 1963 case, Abington v. Shemp, when it rules on this question of devotional reading of the Bible in the public schools and prayer in the public schools, the court says, nothing we have said here indicates that study of the Bible or of religion, when presented objectively as part of a secular program of education, may not be affected consistent with the First Amendment. And in a concurring opinion, we read, one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. There's no constitutional barrier to teaching about religion. There's an education barrier that we don't understand the Constitution enough and the Supreme Court's rulings enough to know that we are permitted to teach courses about the Bible and the world's religions, and that we should do so. The other objection is that it's too controversial. We're in the midst of culture wars. We can barely talk about politics with each other. How can we possibly talk about religion? It's just going to create too many problems. I think this objection is actually based on a misunderstanding of the culture wars. I think the culture wars are a phenomenon that is mostly on television and less among ordinary Americans. If you turn on shows like Hardball, or the show, I guess it's not on anymore, Crossfire, these shows that sound like they were named by adolescent boys. You're going to have like this battle, right, between the fundamentalist, the crazy fundamentalist, and the crazy liberal, the crazy atheist, and the crazy Orthodox Jew, or something like that. And if you watch enough of that television, you start to get the impression that there's this kind of huge battle about religion in American culture. If you actually poll Americans, you actually go around and talk to Americans about these things, it turns out there actually is a huge middle space. And we have a lot of examples of school districts very successfully figuring out how to teach courses about the Bible. About 1/8 of school districts in America have courses about the Bible. This is way too small, but it's also too big to pretend that it can't be done, because it's being done. About 1/8 of American school districts. We also have some school districts that teach courses on the world's religions. The model, unfortunately, is to teach about the world's religions in a world civilization course and to give about a week to the world's religions, which means you have about a day for Buddhism, which means what you can say about Buddhism is there was this fat, happy guy who lived in a palace in North India a long time ago. He left his wife and his children, and he moved out of the palace, and he took off his clothes, except for maybe a little loincloth, and he wandered around northern India, and he sat down, and he thought about the reality of the world, and he realized that all suffering was based on desire. And that was the Buddha. That's about all you can do. But we do have a place like Modesto, California, which has instituted a required 9th grade course on the world's religions for all of its students. About 1,000 a year take this course. It's a very successful course. It was done in an area where you might expect a culture war. Very large evangelical Christian population and a large and substantial and vocal population, though a minority, of Indian Americans who practice the religions of Sikhism and Hinduism. But they were able to do it there in a very successful way. So those are my policy considerations. Let me close with a couple admonitions or recommendations about what we can do as individuals, and then I'll open it up for questions. What about us? I think one thing is to read the Bible and read the Quran. You can read the Quran in a weekend. It's short. It's more like the New Testament than like the Bible. It's a relatively short document. You can read it in your book group. It doesn't really take that long. The Bible is longer. It's a little more intimidating. It's harder to get my students to read the Bible, but I do have, maybe I shouldn't say this if there's any ministers here, but there is a Cliff Notes version of the Bible. You can read Genesis, first book of the Bible, and Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and skip everything else. Now, I wouldn't recommend this if you're taking a Bible course and you're supposed to, do the whole course. But if you're just a concerned citizen who recognizes your own biblical illiteracy and you want to address it in a weekend or a few evenings, you can read those two books. I recommend those two books because if you do go to the Congressional Record and you look at the parts of the Bible that are discussed, the biblical characters, the biblical stories, 90% of those stories are in those two books. That's sort of that may be the most important thing you heard today. Why? Well, because Genesis has a lot of those great stories, and because Matthew is slightly longer than the other Gospels, and it tends to have more parables, so we can talk to our friends. When you talk to your friends about their religions, remember what I've told you about how little Americans know about their own religions, and maybe be a little skeptical about what you hear, because maybe they're not the best resources for absolutely everything about their own religion. So remember that part, but that shouldn't dissuade you entirely from engaging in this. Now let me end with this last point, and that is that every year I talk to my students in intro to religion classes, and I tell them that there are two worthy things to do with a college education. One is to prepare yourself for a life of work where you can make money and you can support yourself and support a family, and that's a worthy and important pursuit. The other thing is to find questions that are worth addressing, questions that are hard to answer, questions that you can't answer on an exam or in a semester or maybe even in a lifetime. And we often think about the world's religions as answer banks of sorts. You have a big question, you can go to Judaism and have it answered, or you can go to the Bible and have it answered. But from my perspective of my years of studying the world's religions, I think actually religions are better understood as repositories of big questions. If you are looking around for a big question to which you might devote your life, I think religions are a wonderful source of big questions. Yes, they occasionally offer answers to these questions, but they don't always. Sometimes they are more adept, even inside themselves, at posing big questions rather than answering them. And so I think one other reason to be interested in addressing in our own lives the problem of religious illiteracy is the possibility that we might be challenged to think about and address questions that we haven't addressed before. So let me conclude on that point as my students say, that's just me. What about you?